Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Guvanch, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with equity and inclusion advocate Manpreet Dhillon. Manpreet is a certified personal and executive coach, human resources professional, and internal auditor who uses her skills and expertise to create strong organizational cultures and provide economic empowerment to equity deserving groups. Her experience in community development, knowledge transfer, project management, and gender mainstreaming sets her apart as an expert in the field. With over 20 years of experience in leadership, coaching, human resources, and change management, Manpreet focuses on creating systemic change to address institutionalized inequalities through representation from the communities being served. As a settler, born in Canada with parents from India, and someone living with an invisible disease, Manpreet is a powerful advocate for others who live with it too. She also serves as an ambassador with the Women Enterprise Center and was a business coach for the Entrepreneurs with Disabilities program. In 2018, she led one of the first trade missions held by a private company, guiding women entrepreneurs to Croatia to further the mission of increasing exports by women entrepreneurs. Manpreet has held positions as a board member of the Canada-India Education Society, Live Big Society, British Columbia Institute of Technology Alumni Board of Directors, and was a past board member of Royal Roads University, and has served on various arts and health boards. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Manpreet Dhillon. She is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and we've been very much looking forward to this conversation. So I'm so glad this is happening today. Manpreet, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's took us a while, but we're here. So
I know, and I'm happy for our audience. And for them, please tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what brought you to become an advocate and consultant today.
yeah, so my work actually started I decided at 13 that I wanted to end sexism, racism, and more. Don't and I something about eggs was in there, but I still haven't figured out the eggs thing because I still eat eggs. But it was interesting because having decided at such a young age that I wanted to, create change in the world. Um, I I started off in a very different career path. I started off with the kinesiology, then electronic engineering, and I was kept getting drawn back to him, well, I'm good with people. So ended up with a master's in organizational management, um, and working in HR kind of related roles. But I never was like an HR professional, like a human resources professional. So it was my career path has always been on the periphery of things. And I just made it. So in 2005, what happened was I joined an arts organization, and I was volunteering, and we were looking at bringing cultures together through arts and dance. And through that, I was like, hey, wait a second, we could do this in the workplace. At that time, D&I was obviously D&I, diversity inclusion has been around since the 1960s, but it wasn't something I was very aware of, that it was a field or something to do with it. So when I started to look at it in the workplace, I'm like, what would happen if we actually had people fully flourish in the workplace, where they fully embraced their cultures and we actually understood how the culture was actually influencing them in their work. We started doing, this sounds cheesy, but culture days within the workplace. So we would teach people about foods, language, and how different workplaces around the world operated. And all of a sudden, you had this one woman, she's Korean, and she was teaching us, and she was like, I don't speak up in meetings all the time, because she's like, I come from a hierarchy, thing, and when I'm in meetings, I still remember that I'm not supposed to speak up in meetings, even though I have a senior position here. And so all of a sudden her teammates started interacting with her differently. And so anyways, that's actually where all this work started. And over time, I've done a lot of different things, worked with different startups, worked in government, with the UN agencies, have my own diversity inclusion consulting firm. We have at some point we had a tech product that we were developing as well. But everything always comes back to, how do we create experiences where people feel like they belong and are accepted? Because when I was younger, growing up to immigrant parents, I always felt like I was second class, and I never want anyone else to feel like that again. So my entire life has been from that position of how do we have people feel powerful in their lives and feel that they're contributing at the level that they can and they should be, and they feel that they can be fully embrace who they are with wherever they are, and and be credited with that as well. So a lot of my work centers around that now.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. Obviously, it's also an area very near and dear to my heart. And you said DEI like practices and organizations started in 1960. And I'm like, whoa, what did that look like back then? I wonder. And I think what you said in terms of having a sense of belonging is so powerful because in the end, that's what we aim for, right? I think, and we chatted about this probably with you before when we look at the sort of like the DEI landscape today in the world, I feel like in industries or organizations, it feels like we're at the like the very beginner level of like a video game, right? Like there's a lot of representation efforts and diversity efforts, but representation is not diversity and diversity is not inclusion. And also, how do we really create an inclusive environment and increase sense of belonging once we are diverse? I think that's an area that is kind of like really we're not there yet, right? Because once we have that diversity, how do we work well within that diversity? How do everyone feel welcome? How do we get to know each other's culture? I think that's like what you described as beautiful in terms of like you're taking people out in like a world trip almost and within their like office space. So I think like with that, where are you seeing like, and first of all, how do you like what are your thoughts on that? Like where we are at today, like globally. Um, and then are you seeing any kind of like challenges or bottlenecks that are kind of like getting in the way for us to like advance in that like video game today?
Yeah. Well, it does feel like a video game, totally. It depends on where you're talking about in the world, right? So Canada and the US I mean, even Canada and US are very different than each other and
Yeah.
on like what's important, what's happening, and how things are being dealt with. Then you come to Europe, where the conversation in some ways is just starting. Like I currently live in the Netherlands, and many times when I start talking about race, people are like, we don't need to talk about that. It's about gender equality. It's about people with disabilities. It's like the race thing is not even a conversation that they even want to touch or approach. And like we literally did some market research out here, and we had these CEOs being like, we don't have a problem. People of color just don't want to move into leadership. And I'm like, okay, but I mean, again, it was like a very fragmented, and I'm like, obviously we need to do more research because this is not the belief for everyone. But it was also like 30 people said this to us, and I'm like, okay, well, what does this actually, why is this happening? Why did we even attract all these people? Like, that's all another thing. And then when we go back to like Asia or Africa, I mean, a lot of the times, and we have this conversation with friends all the time, some people just need to get fed. Like diversity and inclusion, sometimes it feels like it's a first world problem because it's when you don't have your basic hierarchy of needs met in different ways, you're not going to care about inclusion. I'm sorry to say. Like what you're going to care about is the fact that like I need a job, I need food on the table, I need my family fed, and I need to think about my about in terms of rights as well. So when we think about this work, I think it's really living in Europe has really provided me a whole different like viewpoint on like how grateful we need to be for the fact that we can have these conversations. This conversation started with the race in the 1960s. It was about getting Black women, voices at the table and what that looked like. And and then from there has evolved. But sometimes we still like we kind of forget, well, where did it come from? And we know that there's all these other voices that need to be a part of it and what inclusion really looks like for everyone, because we know that these people are members of society. And I think we were talking about looking at even inclusive design or inclusive, like the way that we create spaces and what does that look like so people do feel like they belong, because those spaces aren't going to be exclusive to who comes and sees them. But we
Yeah.
need to make sure those voices are a part of the spaces when we're designing them as well, so that they feel that they're represented when it comes down to it. So it's a really interesting place to be in right now, because doing this work, and I might be not the best advocate for this work right now, because I mean, I think that the ESG conversation, like, environmental social governance, is a more powerful conversation if we have all of this sustainable, and the social and governance is actually really foundational with the way that the organizations function, what's measured.
Yeah.
We would have good business practices and we would be inclusive. But we don't have good business practices, and that's actually what we're trying to correct in many ways. So it's
Exactly. Like it's all intertwined, right? Like social sustainability in the end goes hand in hand with environmental sustainability. And I think I'm seeing more and more organizations like merging those conversations, which is exciting to see because I mean, I think any effort that was done in silos, or, oh, this is like a diversity thing, this is a environmental thing, like that really didn't work. And in the end, we do know, and finally we're seeing more like reports and research publication around it, that like how diversity fosters innovation, which clearly we're in like desperate need of with all the challenges we have in the world. um I think like what I love that you gave kind of like a snapshot of where we are at like globally too, because we definitely see that as well. Like when we have conversations around like diversity and inclusion in like Europe, sometimes we do get reactions like, oh, like we have two more like women on our board, right? So it's like, and that I guess is like the danger of kind of lumping everything into what inclusion means, right? Like what do we, and this is generally like we started to pay a lot of attention to the word choices that we're in conversations, just because I think some terms or like words are just used as like a blanket statement for like everything. Oh, we're being very inclusive, like we just hired like, or like we just have this person, you know, like it's very, but who are we inclusive of? Like I think really identifying communities or identifying who has been excluded historically, right? I think that kind of, I mean, we're really, and this is more like the education piece, I feel like, where we're talking about like how inclusion is really a roadmap and there's no one and done. And there probably won't be ever like one and done, because like society evolves, language changes, what we said like a few years ago maybe is not okay today. Generational expectations change. So what we think is inclusive today may not necessarily be like 10 years from now. And I think that I feel like maturity of thought, it's not there yet. But at the same time, to your point, um due to whoever may be at the seat today, or the urgencies or priorities may lie, or like the bias or perspectives that senior leadership might have in a country, or economic state of the country, where inclusion sounds like a luxury, right? Like this feeling, sense of belonging, where it's everything is more about survival. Um, but I'm trying to like and this is just like day-to-day like reflections on like the status quo as well, but there is like a global, and to me I'm like interested in like how do we merge or like really meet the gap there in terms of like globally there are things that we hope to see, right? In terms of making people feel welcome and belong, and there's a gap there when we see at the locals, right? And that can be local, regional, local organization, local department, even like even within organizations, how every team is like functioning is quite different. um so in your mind, and this is like a very big question, do you see kind of like a clear roadmap on like how we can like progress over time when it comes to sort of like both meeting people where they are, but having a clear understanding on how we evolve the conversation, other than just like trying to educate people on where we need to be?
Yeah, totally. I think one of the biggest things, and I'm a bit like my biggest, what I like to focus on right now is making sure that people understand what this actually means. Like I have had multiple conversations with CEOs around the world where like they're like, I don't really know what inclusion means. Like I don't know what that actually means as
Yeah.
how would I measure that within my organization? What does that actually look like? Or
Right.
how's that going to change in my team? Or how's that going to change my culture? Right? And I think that's a very valid question. We're not talking about that enough. We're like, well, we want people to feel like they belong and accepting, but that's a very subjective experience that people are going to have.
Yeah.
So how are they supposed to measure? Like, you can have inclusion surveys, like we have inclusion assessments. But again, those are subjective based on how does someone feel that day when they're taking it? What does that look like? There's so many other factors, even when they're taking these surveys about what their experience is like. It's a good benchmark for a snapshot in time, but it doesn't also, it's not always, but what does that actually look like tangibly, right? And I think one of the biggest things that I'm finding is the facilitated conversations around, let's bring to the table, let's meet you where you're at. And what are your hesitations? Like, I have this conversation around all the time where like I've had so many white men say to me, they're like, well, I don't feel like I belong in the workplace anymore. I don't get jobs. Like I'm having a really hard time. And I'm like, and I sympathize with them. And I've had other friends who are like, well, why are you sympathizing? I mean, like, because I go, the whole point of this work is not to exclude other people. The
Yeah.
whole point is that we're supposed to move forward together, not from a place of we're going to take something away from you.
Yeah.
And, I, and that's the conversations we need to have more of. Like, this isn't about taking away from someone else. This is about creating equitable systems so other people can, we're actually, when we make those final decisions, they're made from a place of, is this the best person for the job? And like, is this what the organization really needs right now? Do we have the diversity of thought? Do we have the perspectives that we need right now? Not based on their identity. Like I dislike so much when people hire me because of my skin color and because I do DEI work. Like it's like the worst thing that when someone could say to me, they're like, "Oh, we hired you because you're brown." I'm like, that's the worst thing you can say to me because I'm like, I have 20 years experience. I've done change management. I've done like management consulting. Like there's so much that I've done ahead, like to get to this point.
Right.
Like you're just diminished actually all my efforts. And I have too many of my friends because I do a lot of coaching with women of color and in within the workplace, and they're just like, some of them are just like, first of all, we don't want to be identified as women of color, which is totally like, and they're like, our challenges are different for sure, but they're like, we got hired based on our merit. And they're like, we're tired of people just assuming that we got hired because of something else, because we're not having those conversations. We're having these conversations around representation when we're actually not talking about the fact of let's create equitable systems, create, is it a fair system that, we're actually analyzing our bias at each stage saying, how else could we perceive like what the requirements for the role are? What are the requirements? And it's not just an HR problem. That's the other thing. Diversity inclusion is not an HR thing. It should not, actually don't even think it should be centered in HR. This is me being in my soapbox. It actually needs to be like, again, it has to be like a foundational piece that's actually cut across everything. You need to look at inclusive marketing. You need to look at inclusive product and service design. You need to think about supplier diversity because all of those things actually think about how are you creating equitable systems across the organization. And those are the conversations, like if we're actually going to move any of this forward, people need to have those conversations. I mean, like the best conversations I have are with teams thinking about, well, where are ways that you think about being equitable? Where have you thought about what inclusion looks like within your team? And all of a sudden they're like, hey, wait a second, like we don't actually consult with this group, but they're actually benefiters of our programs. And I'm like, well, like how can you go and access the information from that group so they can be more included? And those are like, that's actually when the work is actually really, when we really embed it within the way that we work as well.
Yeah. I mean, I love like several things I want to like highlight from what you said. So the fact that you're even like getting a comment like we hired you because you're brown. Like how, first of all, how offensive is that? But also like
Yeah.
it's so like it's fascinating to me how it's not so like how a person may not be aware that it's like a different form of like othering, right? It's almost like there was like we did an entire study on in the fashion industry when the plus size category like came out, it was like you go shop from there. But we have products for you, right? Like you're like, am I included? And then we said like you would think like there would be learning in that in the industry, and then we started to see like adaptive category for people with disabilities, and then it's like there. So it's just like, people want to feel part of like society and community, and they want to. I also like in a co-creation panel, I remember in a session, one of like the Black participants said like, I don't want to think that the most senior job I can get is only like chief diversity officer. Right.
Yeah, totally. Like it's not, I actually, it's funny, like I was like, oh, because my background's in HR, I'm like, I always like actually got mad at myself. I'm like, why did you take fields that require, like they always want the different people. And I'm like, Sarah, I'm like, you're not changing any numbers. Started working in gender equality, but I'm like, and I'm in a field that's mostly women dominated.
Yeah.
And then I ended up doing diversity inclusion work. And I'm like, you just screwed yourself over. Like if you're trying to change the numbers, I'm like, you're ended up pigeonholing yourself. So is that like I totally hear it. Like it's just so
I also like know a friend, I won't give names or like context of the organization, but he was like responsible of like recruiting a board member for big organization. And then obviously they wanted some like diversity. So the most qualified person who's like a rock star he found was like a person with a vision impairment who's also part of the LGBTQ community. And the board did not like it because it wasn't visible. Like, how bad is that? Anyway, but yeah, I think like there's those I always like remind myself progress is not linear, right? Even the fact that we're having those conversations are meaningful. And what you said in terms of like as a starting point to ask what does inclusion mean to you, I think that's so beautiful because suddenly like it makes, you know, all these big words that we don't know how to take action on, like climate change, inclusion, sustainability. So suddenly it makes it relatable and potentially actionable because then, and I love that it also kind of takes away like now inclusion, inclusive design is kind of thought like, I mean, yes, there's HR aspect to it. And if there's going to be like budgets involved, it wants to be utilized for like marketing purposes. So it has to be visible. So let's talk about inclusion of our consumers, customers. But in the end, real inclusion happens like if it's more human centric, right? Like it's not just about who you're selling to, but also your organization. So I think that like the question that you're asking makes it more actionable and also takes it away from you know, seen as like an HR thing or like even like even if it's on like the consumer ending side, charitable thing almost, right? It's about like working well together. It's about innovation. It's about like well-being of the corporation and like the brand, right? And I think that like mindset shift, even though still like maybe it lives a lot in like HR and kind of like representation and marketing. I think like having those like workshops and sessions with you is creating those like mindset shifts within organizations where it has to I'm hoping that will lead kind of like that bottom up also cultural push, right? Like cultural change. Um because also, yes, like it would be amazing if there's like senior leadership who's like fully understanding what this means and like honing in on that, but we would be naive to assume like entire senior leadership in the world would have that approach. So what you're doing feels like really would like activate areas that needs to be activated to change to kind of like accelerate that cultural shift.
Well,
Um,
and
go
that's the
ahead.
whole thing. Just a point on that. Sorry to cut you off, but like, but that's the whole thing because like it can't just be leadership. Like, and then that's actually one of the things that like annoys me all the time because it's not. We can't just say that leadership has to do it. It's actually that all of us have a role to play in like to be inclusive team members. We have a role to play in how we're inclusive community members. You know, and it's about the way that not just in the workplace, but like how you show up on a day-to-day basis. Like, sure, you can be inclusive in the workplace, but then outside you don't you all your friends are all the same background, the same income level and the same education level, and you're like, oh, I'm so inclusive. It's like, well, really, are you though? Because you're like all the talk conversation you're having is all the same.
Yeah, or even like with like acknowledging our differences and trying to figure out how to work well together. Like we have a lot of neurodiversity in our team, and like how do we work with that better, right? Like how do we acknowledge that one person might have ADHD or dyslexia and just like have more like ways of working that could like be both ease their like colleagues like job, but also like helps you to make sure you don't get frustrated for something that you really don't have to, right? So like those even like basic things, or even like we all, and this is like kind of, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. We're very big on also like kind of breaking the stigma around talking about like bias, because even if we think we don't have any like bias, we have subconscious biases, right? And how is that reflecting in our behaviors, in our work relationships, and how might we address that? So like owning we're human, like knowing that we're human, we all have biases, and how do we address those to also be more inclusive? I think those type of like exercises is just I feel like really necessary to also make things less corporate. Like just remembering in the end, even if we have deadlines like P&Ls, whatever, like KPIs, like we're humans running these things. Even if AI is helping us with 80% of the things in the future, we're still humans, like humans are going to be involved. So how to humanize. And I think it really starts with like starting to own kind of your own stuff, and be more open about like being honest and having a constructive approach in terms of like how to address that. Do you see and sometimes like in your work where kind of that comfort is hard to achieve or attain just because of like the existing organizational context or like culture? Like what are some of the challenges in like rehumanizing processes and kind of these like sessions?
I'm giggling because like so it happens all the time, like because it depends on who you talk to, right? Because then you have, I mean, even when we had a chat like a couple months ago, like we just like it was connected, like we were able to have like more of authentic, it
Yeah.
was a more authentic conversation. It was just like we both, it just like we all showed up and it was like it was great.
Yeah.
But when you have it with other people, they'll be like, even if you say, oh, even if you tell them like, oh, I'm having an off day, they're gonna be like, oh, she's not professional. She's not like this. Like, and all the, how that kind of show, like that may show up in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually one of the most interesting things with how we're shifting. Because when people think about what corporate actually means, it's not what corporate actually is. There's so many organizations out there that don't operate that way anymore.
Yeah.
And we, but they're going to change because we show up differently. And it's also the different generations show up differently, right? I was having a conversation with a friend last night where I'm a little bit more like, I do a lot of self-reflection. So I was like, oh yeah, I'm feeling all these things. And she's like, your feelings are getting in the way of everything.
Yeah.
And I go, it's interesting. I go, like that's my work. And so we ended up having this like deep conversation around the fact that feelings are about being human, and sometimes they are going to show up in the workplace. But what does that look like? That doesn't mean that you're any less professional because you have feelings.
Yeah.
It means that you have to find tools on how to manage those feelings so you can still get to, finishing the deadline or doing all these other things as well, right?
Yeah.
And and it's also like thinking about when we're thinking about the humanizing, even all these deadlines, like those are very colonial way of working. And when we think about the decolonized ways of working, like I always think about it from, I mean, being Canada, decolonization means something very different. And but when coming from an Indian family, I'll go back to Punjab, and the way that they build relationships there, the way that they work is in a very different way than what I'm used to.
Yeah.
So when I'm like, okay, we have deadlines, we have this meeting, what's the next step? They're like, let's meet a couple more times and see if we want to trust each other and build a relationship. And I'm like, that's such a waste of time, right? Like it's not, but it's like, but it's also like, that's why I'm so colonized, and that's where my bias shows up. And I have to be conscious about that when I'm like showing up in these spaces where they do work in a decolonized way. And how do I decolonize my way of thinking and being, and actually question myself in a way of like, what biases am I showing up with? Where am I not meeting the other person where they're at? And those are the two questions I actually lead with a lot of the times, because knowing that it's going to be different in each situation as well.
Yeah. Oh my God. Like I'm reflecting on your like own reflections too. And I'm like thinking, I've been brainwashed for like 4 years. My undergrad was in industrial engineering. The tagline is basically minimize cost, maximize profit. Like I'm like I like came out like about time efficiency, like time motion studies, like, super like capitalist soldier, right? Like that's how I came out of like that 4-year program. And in the end, it's very interesting because like we were having another interview on this like podcast, and we were talking about like I identify as an AI optimist, and I was saying because I'm intrigued in how it might actually support us on the things that take so much time, where it could free our time into more like critical thinking to to efforts in more inclusion or looking into ethics of the work itself, right? Like all the things we have an excuse to not pay attention to now because of our deadlines and things like that. I'm actually very interested in how AI might support. And then the person I was interviewing said like, but the reason why you're thinking that is because of the system itself. Like you're thinking we still need that efficiency so that we can create. And then I'm like, oh my God, yes, because I'm like wired that way. So obviously, like we're very, very big on like celebrating each like small wins too in the progress towards like all these inclusion and sustainability work. So I'm very much interested in like finding ways in creating more opportunities within the system that we're in, knowing that the system is not going anywhere anytime soon, but at the same time realizing that we need to create the space for ourselves to always rethink or redesign a system, right? So I do want to address the problem today and not necessarily because, and full respect to them. There are agencies or organizations or designers or strategists who are like, we only, consult on the greater good projects and things like that, which I totally respect and admire. But I almost feel like that's why we're kind of like sour. We're like, okay, is this a situation? So how are we going to address it? So I do want like practical wins today, but I'm also realizing I need to remind myself in the end, this is not healthy. So how we should not perpetuate the same problem, but we also need to like, it's a very fine balance. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, because I'm all about efficiency. Like my job is about workflow process and efficiency and like how do we make it equitable and inclusive, right? So I'm totally with you on that. On the other hand, because the thing is, I find that if you're efficient, then people will have time more for the real things in life,
Yeah.
right? Like I mean, even for myself, like I use AI now because I have more times to go back to ancient food knowledge and looking at Ayurvedic ways of living and having more time to cook because I'm able to like actually have space to do that because I'm able to make my job more efficient so I can actually go back to like living in a way that's more sustainable for be a better steward of the land that I'm living on as well, or steward of my body and like steward of the systems that I'm part of. So I think that we always have to, it's a catch-22 in many ways because the efficiency is, there's a reason it's going to benefit us in different ways, but that just because it's efficient doesn't mean we have to work more. And I think that's where the fine balance comes in. And it's like, if you look at the efficiency as a way to humanize your life a little bit more and finding ease in your life, like, I mean, the fact is like through AI now, we can like learn multiple languages. We can do all these other things. Like we have so many ways of interacting with each other. Like, so I live in I live in the Netherlands. Thinking about language, like this was like, and I use this story because it's about going back to how technology impacted it, but also going back to like the human self. So yeah, so like living in the Netherlands, like it was like really thinking about how language is such an important part of my life, right? Because being in like everyone speaks English, being at the grocery stores, but you need to know a little bit of Dutch because everything's in Dutch when you're looking at it. You can use Google Translate, great. But then I started to notice and how much I'm missing out on little parts of life. Like at the coffee shop, you can't really just, just talk to someone. Like you can say hi to each other, but you're not really having any type of interaction. When someone speaks to you, you're missing out on these little things. And then so as I'm starting to learn the language using obviously my gamified Duolingo and like trying to figure out things, I started to think about like, even I grew up in a Punjabi household and Punjabi was my second language, but I'm like, how much of my life, my parents' life, I didn't connect to because I didn't know the language fully either. And so as I started to talk to them about it and I'm like missing those cultural nuances, and now through technology and like the efficiency of being able to learn through apps, have a better relationship with my parents because now I understand the Punjabi language in a very different way than I ever did before. And I'm able to like understand the nuances of when they're talking about certain things in Punjabi that I would never had a concept of unless I had learned the language in a deeper way. So I think like that's where like technology plays a really beautiful role in our lives, but we have to look at it how it actually still humanizes us and how can we use that for human experiences as well.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a beautiful human example. And what another area that I'm really interested in exploring, like the reason, especially like in inclusive design today, why it is hard for many designers to like practice maybe the multidimensionality almost of like the data, the insights, right? So like because I think the current training and education you get in like design and research, you have a brief, you go with that, right? But if the brief is like very diverse and nuanced, how do you go about that? Which, co-design is obviously a great way to address that, but also how might technology support us in even like processing that data, not necessarily like telling us what to do, but really helping us in terms of like even, if we need to use softwares for design, automating some of that process so we could actually understand the research a bit more, even in like programming, right? Like, I remember having this conversation, which was like very off-putting, but I asked, there's a lot of hype about like in a discussion, like a fireside chat in a conference around like the scaling of like digital money and like AR, VR, like all of that. So my question was like, I'm curious, what is being done to kind of prepare and prevent people from, falling behind, right? Like what are we doing towards that? Not only I didn't get like a good answer, like I was like, first I was like, I felt like I was a downer in the party. Like the vibe shifted. Like we were like so hyped. Like, why are you bringing that up? Like that, they didn't say that, but that's like the face that I was reading. The first response I got was, which was horrible, was, oh, there will always be late adopters, that's not what I was talking about. But the second answer, maybe it was a bit worse because the person actually understood what I was talking about, but said, when you're consuming what we've already published out into the world, we're working on the next project that is going to launch in 6 months. So basically what he was telling me, like, they don't have time to think about these things. So I'm excited in, like, if AI can help with 80% of the programming and code writing and things like that, what space does that open up for engineers? Are they going to actually question the data that they're working on? Are they going to look into whether it or not it has bias, if the research was done inclusively, right? Like all of those things. But exactly to your point, I think with any tool that kind of has its like virtues, we even saw this like with social media. I love that there's more transparency around the events happening around in the world. And it's like a connecting opportunity for people who normally couldn't like have their voices heard, right? But at the same time, the mental health damage that it's doing and all the other like vices that come along with it, right? So there was no regulation around that. We didn't do much around that, and now we're like kind of putting out fire as we go. Hopefully that doesn't we learn from that and don't apply that in AI. But it's, again, it seems like it's moving so fast. I mean, obviously there are teams like looking into like the ethics responsibility and inclusion aspect of things, but it feels like it's not the same amount of effort as like the technology development and advancement, right? It's not equal really.
Right.
So again, with caution, I'm being optimist, but like with caution, that's where I lie. But I think it could really change in a great way the equity and inclusion work, and that really excites me.
It totally can, but it also, if the critical analysis is not done, right? Because like a lot of the AI right now we have has a lot of bias built in,
Yes.
based on, because of historically, I mean,
Yeah.
who's doing the programming,
Yeah.
like,
To our current like situation, like status quo,
yeah.
right?
And so, and even if when we access that information, like people can't, you have to people need to be training themselves to say, what bias might exist in the work that like what I'm getting from AI, and
Yeah.
how do I interpret this a little bit differently, or what other lens do I need to take from this? I mean, until we get to that stage, that's actually when we cannot like. So I'm cautiously optimistic, because I think that I don't feel like I feel like we've taken a step back from DEI stuff anyways, where people aren't really thinking about it. They think it's an add-on. They don't realize that it actually is a part of the work. Like, this is actually a better way of doing business. It's a better way of designing. It's a better way of doing everything.
Yeah.
They actually think it's just an add-on. I was like, no, it's actually the only way that you can do things moving
Yeah,
forward.
exactly.
But until we get to that stage, they're not going to start to critically think as well. So yeah, so I'm cautiously optimistic about it.
So true. And I would love to get your thoughts on how do we accelerate that. I was actually in Mumbai in November. And so the prompt, the work is more around like how so Mumbai aims to be carbon neutral by 2050, and how can it meet its goal, right? So that was like the main prompt. And so how we reframed it around was like also looking into and understanding the people, which then like when you analyze kind of the demographic and how it like reflects onto the landscape, like 55% of the population lives in informal settlements. And this goal there's no way of achieving if you don't have people on board, right? So that was like kind of our first reaction in terms of, this is not a charitable case or like a redevelopment opportunity for a developer, right? Like this, or like housing. This is actually, if you really want to achieve this goal, this is actually you like having to like get people on board and really align on things on how to activate communities, how to have them engaged so they can participate in your goals. Because exactly to your point earlier, we all have a role in everything happening today, right? Whether that's like being inclusive, whether that's like climate change or like environmental friendliness, like we all can have our roles, even if we can't change everything. And even with the AI, because if you're anti-AI, your voice matters so that it creates caution, right? So everybody has its role. So we kind of like reframed it in a way that how might they be like active part of this process and be activated and be part of like the conversations. And we kind of like hosted these like various co-creation sessions with CBOs and people living in informal settlements, which was like so eye-opening. And the biggest insight I think for the corporation was more like, oh, this is not like a social good responsibility thing, right? But the fact that like first I was like, oh, could that be like the real only big insight that they took away really out of like all of that? But then you're seeing, well, that's the mindset shift though. Like that's what we really need. And that's what actually matters because then everything else would follow. So it was such a satisfying experience, but I'm curious in your thoughts on like how do we switch to that mindset faster almost because also like the climate change or like carbon neutral, we have so many urgent problems in the world that we need to address that really calls for diverse working, innovation, inclusion. It's not just nice to have. So how does that happen? Like, does there always have to be a crisis to like raise awareness in this thing? And like, how are we going to really make a case that would expedite the mindset shift?
This is where I think the grassroots level and getting people to ask the right questions, like where you get people to ask the question, like, how is this inclusive? If at any type of any project,
Right.
it's like anytime you're part of anything, it's like, how can this be more inclusive? Like, or what are some other things that we need to consider? That's actually how change is going to happen. I hope like D&I professionals don't exist. Like, I don't think we need to exist.
Right.
Yeah, like if we have enough champions in the world, it's just going to be embedded in asking the right questions. All it is about asking the right questions. Like, it's about like, how are you addressing bias in this? Like, how are we making sure that we are bringing the right people along for who are going to be impacted by this?
Yeah.
And like those questions are part of project planning is what's going to make the difference. And all of a sudden it's going back to you're meeting the values of values of the people involved, you're meeting the values of the organization. All of a sudden they don't see it as an extra work. They're just like, oh, we never, like, that's a great question. And that's actually how we actually start to see this work kind of like transpire a lot faster and get there a lot faster as well.
I love that. It's almost like instead of like waiting on like a corporate 2030 vision on our like diversity or like 2050, it's more like these interventions, like inclusion interventions into their day-to-day life, right? Like when you're starting a meeting, this is the first question you ask, right? Like almost like things that are like practical toolkit in terms of incorporating into the day-to-day.
Yeah, like I've had like with some of the organizations we work with, we just give them like, here's a inclusive meetings like thing that you could use a part of your agendas and a part of in your boardrooms, and all of a sudden they're like, that's super easy. But then now like it's become a part of the fixtures on the wall. But every time they walk by, it like prompts them like, hey, do we ask that question? And it's like we become this like thing about like, are we asking the question in each of those spaces?
Yeah, I think that's like our own maybe like bias also like working in the space. Like we need to move like maybe because it's easy, it will stick. So it's actually better that it's like easy and like, it's like so obvious, right? Like I often like remind myself to say like just because it's common sense doesn't mean it's common practice, right? So I'm really like trying to okay, we should just state the obvious. We should go back to the basics and like really which also helps in like humanizing things. Because and not everything published has to come out with like technical language that 1% of people like understand.
And people just want to know what they can do. Like, and that's actually that at the end of the day, like, they're just like, what can I do that's easy? And the people like, maybe this is my idealistic, perspective, and that's where like ending this off. But like, I think that I feel like people are inherently good and they want to do good in the world, but they just don't know how that is, and they just need to be prompted on what those prompts are. And that's actually where AI could actually help and like all this stuff, it's all about like, how can we just be a better person and how can we just do a little bit better just by asking the question or talking to someone else that we weren't going to talk to otherwise.
I love that so much. I feel like it was also like a great advice, but anything else you would want to add for anyone who wants to, let's not say disrupt, there's no immediate disrupting, but like try to make progress, push boundaries for like a better future for us.
Ask the questions. It's like, it comes back to like so simple, like ask the question, like ask, how can this be more inclusive? Ask, where's the bias showing up? That will start to disrupt a lot of things more than we think.
I love that. I wish somebody told me that. Also, because it gives you kind of like this empowerment to like speak up, which you don't want to do when you're like young professional. So, yes, Manpreet, this was so awesome. I feel like I can talk to you all day.
Same. This is so good, but I was like, yeah, it's going to be a very long episode.
Yeah. Well, should the audience follow up on anything happening anytime soon? Do you want to like say anything?
Yeah, you can post everything on LinkedIn. So my LinkedIn is like LinkedIn Manpreet Dhillon, and that's where anything new kind of happens. We are going to be we're doing more stuff around future of work and looking at women's health in the workplace. We're actually starting up some cool projects around that. So it'll be kind of exciting to see feedback and insights from that too.
Amazing. So encouraging audience to engage on Manpreet's posts and ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you.